Roy Buchanan. What if I told you the greatest guitar player you've never heard of died alone in a jail cell, 10 minutes after a guard walked past his door and saw absolutely nothing wrong? Here's the strange part. His hands were the calmest thing about him. He could stand on a stage and make a guitar sound like it was crying, screaming, begging, and the entire time his face wouldn't move an inch. He once told a friend that while everyone thought he looked so peaceful up there, he was actually screaming on the inside the whole time. Write that down, because it's going to matter later. This is a man who taught the guy who became the lead guitarist of one of the most legendary rock groups in American history. A man Jeff Beck sat and listened to for an hour, completely floored. A man Eric Clapton flat out called the best guitarist alive. A man who maybe, turned down a spot in the Rolling Stones. He sold 500,000 copies of one record, and never once landed a hit single. He played Carnegie Hall one year, and was cutting hair for a living not long before that. He was inventing sounds with his bare hands that other guitarists needed machines and pedals to even attempt copying. And somehow, almost nobody outside of guitar nerds knows his name. His name was Roy Buchanan, and what happened in the final 21 minutes of his life is something his own family has never been able to accept. Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to have questions too. And if stories like this hit you in the chest a little, go ahead and subscribe before we dive in, because we're just getting started. Roy Buchanan. For years, Roy told people a beautiful story about where he came from. He said his dad was a hellfire Pentecostal preacher, the kind who stomped around revival tents, while Roy sat in the back soaking up gospel music and the raw, wailing sound that black churches were known for. That's supposedly where the screaming tone in his guitar was born. Reporters loved it. They wrote it down for years without ever double-checking it. It wasn't true. Roy's father was actually a sharecropper, a farm laborer named Bill Buchanan, who hauled the family from Arkansas out to the dusty cotton fields of Pixley, California, when Roy was barely 2 years old. When someone eventually asked Roy's own brother, J.D., about this preacher legend, he didn't hold back. He basically said that if their father had ever set foot inside a church, the roof would have come down on him. But here's the thing. The music part was real. Roy really did go to revival meetings, just not with his father. He went with his mother, Minnie, who used to bring her painfully shy little boy to racially mixed gospel services, the kind most white families in that valley wouldn't have been caught dead at. That's where a small, quiet kid first heard people sing like their entire lives depended on it. He said later that gospel music was his doorway into black music, and that part of his story was completely genuine. So why the fake preacher dad? Probably because poor farm kid who found a guitar didn't sound like destiny. Roy Buchanan stitched a better origin story onto himself, and it's the first of several myths he built around his own life. Which makes you wonder, if a man is willing to rewrite where he came from, what else got quietly rewritten along the way? A 9-year-old who never learned to read music. When Roy turned 9, his parents scraped together enough money to buy him a red Rickenbacker lap steel guitar and pay for 3 years of lessons with a traveling teacher named Clara Pressure, out in Bakersfield. She figured something out about her new student pretty fast. He couldn't read sheet music, not one note. So instead of forcing it, she let him learn by ear. Every chord, every lick, every bend, he'd hear it once and just reach for it with his hands. That's how he played for the rest of his life. A man who could make a guitar weep, howl, and practically talk, and he never once read a line of written music. She did give him one rule though, and it basically became his whole philosophy. If you're not playing with feeling, don't bother playing at all. By 12, he was gigging in honky-tonk bars around the valley. By 15, he'd packed up and left home for Los Angeles, with nothing but a guitar and a dream. Once he got there, a teenager with zero formal training somehow found his way into the orbit of bandleader Johnny Otis, learning right alongside seasoned players like Johnny Guitar Watson. Picture that, a kid who couldn't read a note of music, sitting in rooms full of professionals, and quietly outplaying most of them. That ability to hear something once and instantly make it his own was about to land him in a career most guitarists only dream about. He just had no idea yet that history was going to hand the credit to somebody else. The man who played the hits, nobody knew he played. This is maybe the cruelest pattern in Roy's early career. He kept being in the room when the magic happened, and he kept walking out with nothing. In June of 1958, barely 18 years old, Roy walked into Chess Records in Chicago and laid down a guitar solo on a rockabilly track called My Babe for an artist named Dale Hawkins. The song climbed to number 7 on the R&B charts. His playing was on a hit record. His name was on absolutely nothing. Then there's the legend that's followed him for over 50 years. That Roy played the famous swampy guitar riff on the rock and roll classic Susie Q. Guitar fans have repeated that story for decades. It's wrong. That riff belonged to a teenager named James Burton, who wrote it before Roy ever even joined the band. Roy's actual job each night was standing on stage copying Burton's part note for note. He spent his early career being just good enough to perfectly reproduce someone else's genius. The pattern kept happening. In 1962, he cut sessions with a drummer named Bobby Gregg. One of those tracks, built on riffs Roy played, climbed near the top of the R&B charts. Roy got no credit and barely any money. Just another hit record with his fingerprints all over it, and somebody else's name printed on the label. Most people in that position would have grown loud and bitter about it. Roy went the opposite direction. He got quiet. He started genuinely doubting whether he even deserved to be in the room. A few years later, he walked away from music entirely and enrolled in barber school. But right before he did one thing that would echo through rock history for decades to come. He taught a kid in Canada how to play guitar, Robbie Robertson. In January of 1961, Roy joined the touring band of a rowdy Arkansas singer named Ronnie Hawkins, playing shows up in Toronto. Officially, he wasn't hired to be the star of the show. Part of his job was mentoring Hawkins's young, promising guitarist, a teenager named Robbie Robertson. That teenager would go on to become the lead guitarist and chief songwriter of the band, one of the most influential groups in American music history. And Robertson never forgot the strange, intense older musician who showed him the ropes. He later called Roy the most remarkable guitarist he had ever seen in his life. Robertson once asked Roy the obvious question: how does a human being learn to play like that? Roy looked him dead in the eye, completely straight-faced, and said it was because he was half wolf. And he wasn't entirely joking, at least not in the way that mattered. Roy built these little myths around himself constantly. The preacher father, the wolf blood. Because the truth, a desperately shy farm kid who bled through his fingertips practicing, probably felt too small for the sounds he was capable of making. He'd rather be a werewolf than admit he was just an ordinary guy who worked incredibly hard. He played bass on a Ronnie Hawkins single, bounced through a handful of other bands, married a woman named Judy, and started a family, 7 kids, eventually. By the late 60s, buried under bills he couldn't cover, the most original guitarist almost nobody had heard of, enrolled in barber school, and quietly prepared to give the whole thing up. That's exactly when the phone started ringing. The Rolling Stones. This is the story that made Roy Buchanan famous before his own records ever did. The man who supposedly turned down the Rolling Stones. Roy told this story himself more than once. As he told it, around 1969, his manager at the time, Charlie Daniels, came to him with an offer. The Rolling Stones had lost guitarist Brian Jones and needed a replacement. Word had apparently reached them about this incredible, unknown guitar player in America, and they wanted Roy to tour with them. And Roy said no. In his own words, he didn't know their material well enough and didn't think he could do the job justice. He even admitted, in that blunt, self-deprecating way of his, that he was probably just being lazy. But then he added the line that really tells you who he was at that point in his life. He said the band had already lost one guitarist, and he didn't want to be the next casualty. It's one of the great what-if moments in rock history. The gig eventually went to Mick Taylor. The Stones became the biggest band on the planet. Roy went home to Maryland. But here's where you have to be careful, because this legend might be exactly that, a legend. When Roy's biographer went digging for proof, he tracked down Charlie Daniels, the very manager who supposedly delivered that offer. Daniels said he'd never even heard the story before, and had never once spoken to anyone from the Rolling Stones. The one named witness who could confirm the whole thing flatly denied it ever happened. So was it true, or was it just another one of Roy's myths, like the preacher father and the wolf blood? A story repeated so many times it started to feel real. Nobody can prove it either way. What we do know is that around that same period, Roy and the Rolling Stones did actually cross paths in a recording studio once, and by Keith Richards' own account years later, it didn't go smoothly at all. Richards admitted the band got unusually harsh with Roy that day, because they felt he was being too pushy in the room. Whatever really happened between Roy and the Stones, it didn't end in friendship. That offer might be pure fairy tale, but what happened next was very real, and it was filmed, broadcast, and watched by millions of people. The world's greatest unknown guitarist. In early 1971, a Washington Post writer named Tom Zito walked into a little club in Bladensburg, Maryland, to watch a barber school dropout play guitar on a random weeknight. What he wrote got picked up and reprinted in Rolling Stone magazine, and a phrase got attached to Roy Buchanan that he would never shake for the rest of his life. And honestly, even after his death, the world's greatest unknown guitarist. A public television producer read that phrase and decided to build an entire documentary around it. On November 8, 1971, an hour-long film introducing Roy Buchanan to the whole country aired on public television stations across America. The cameras even followed him back to the cotton fields of Pixley, California, where he'd grown up dirt poor. Standing right there near his childhood home, Roy said something that ended up defining him forever. He said the reason he never made it big was probably that he never really cared about making it big in the first place. All he'd ever wanted was to learn to play guitar for himself. The film hit like lightning. Jeff Beck, already one of the most respected guitarists alive at the time, later said he sat there completely stunned for the entire hour, calling it some of the best playing he'd ever heard in his life, saying Roy broke every rule and just tore it up. John Lennon praised him. Merle Haggard praised him. Almost overnight, the unknown guitarist became one of the most talked-about musicians in America, and record labels came sprinting. A man who had been about to spend his life cutting hair for a paycheck signed a record deal within months. The shy farm kid was finally going to release albums with his own name printed right there on the label for the very first time. What nobody understood yet, including Roy himself, was that fame was about to become the worst thing that ever happened to him. 500,000 records, 0 hits. Roy's debut solo album dropped in September of 1972. It cracked the Billboard chart and moved around 200,000 copies in its first year. Buried in the middle of that record was a track many people still consider the most beautiful thing he ever recorded, an original called The Messiah Will Come Again, which opens with Roy half speaking, half preaching a handful of broken lines about walking through places he never should have gone, before letting the guitar take over and do the crying for him. His second album went gold, moving more than 500,000 copies. He played a sold-out show at Carnegie Hall in June of 1972. By any reasonable measure, the unknown guitarist had officially arrived. Except, he really hadn't. Not in the way that mattered. He never landed a single hit song. His albums sold respectably, and then quietly faded away. And in the studio, Roy was miserable. He felt like producers were burying his guitar underneath slick, polished arrangements, sanding off exactly the raw, dangerous edges that made him sound like himself in the first place. He'd spent his entire life chasing the freedom to make music his own way, and now that he finally had a record deal, it felt like just another cage. And the ability was real, by the way. Nobody was faking this. He produced wah-wah-style sounds with his bare hands, roughly a decade before those pedals were even invented. He bent harmonics into shrieks other players simply couldn't reach. He once took a razor blade to his own amplifier speaker cones just to get a specific distortion he was hearing in his head. Decades later, One of his early instrumental recordings, Sweet Dreams, would close out a Martin Scorsese film and introduce a whole new generation to a name they'd never heard before. But in the moment, all that success felt hollow to him. By 1981, he was so disgusted with the music business that he quit recording altogether, swearing he wouldn't come back unless he had total creative control. The world's greatest unknown guitarist had decided he'd rather be silent than be packaged and sold. And that silence nearly swallowed him whole. I'm screaming inside. For 4 years, Roy pretty much vanished from records. Then a blues label founder named Bruce Iglauer talked him into a comeback, but strictly on his own terms. A real blues album, full artistic control, nobody sanding down his edges this time. The result, released in 1985, was called When a Guitar Plays the Blues. It became the biggest chart success of his entire career, spending 13 weeks on the Billboard chart and earning him a Grammy nomination. Roy called it the best album he ever made. For a brief, shining moment in his mid-40s, it looked like the long-overlooked genius was finally about to get his due. But the man behind that comeback was quietly falling apart. People close to him described someone almost unbearably shy, a performer who sometimes turned his back to the audience mid-show because he couldn't stand the attention, someone who once admitted the whole idea of being a star genuinely terrified him. He drank, and when he drank, friends said it was never in moderation. Iglauer, who knew him well, said Roy came from a deeply religious, dirt-poor family, and seemed to genuinely believe in heaven and hell, quietly seeing himself as a sinner, a man who'd turned his back on God somewhere along the way. There's one moment that sums him up completely. A bandmate once asked Roy how he could look so calm and still while playing music that sounded so violent and emotional. And Roy gave an answer that should have scared everyone around him a little. He said, "Yeah, but inside, he was screaming." His hands stayed calm. His face gave away absolutely nothing. And the whole time, by his own admission, something underneath was howling. Within just a few years of that comeback, whatever was howling inside him would meet a night that the people who loved him have never been able to make sense of. 21 minutes. On the night of Sunday, August 14, 1988, Roy Buchanan was 48 years old. He'd played his final show a week earlier, up in Connecticut. That evening, near his home in Reston, Virginia, there was a domestic argument, and his wife Judy called for help. Police showed up and arrested Roy for public intoxication. According to the deputy sheriff who later spoke with reporters, Roy was clearly drunk, but he showed no signs of being suicidal or depressed. He was taken to the Fairfax County Jail and placed alone in a holding cell at around 10:55 that night. Here's the timeline the authorities laid out. A guard walked past the cell around 11:05 and reported that everything looked fine. Roughly 11 minutes later, at 11:16, Roy was found hanging in the cell, using his own shirt. Officers tried desperately to revive him. The deputy later said Roy was a big, heavy man, and that the shirt had crushed his larynx, making it physically impossible to force air back into his lungs. He said if that hadn't happened, he genuinely believed they could have saved him. Roy was pronounced dead just before midnight. The official ruling was suicide. The deputy noted it was the first death like this, in that jail, in nearly 8 years. That's what the official record says. The greatest guitarist almost nobody had heard of, a man who had clawed his way through poverty and obscurity and a brutal music industry, was gone in about 21 minutes. The gap between the moment they locked him in that cell and the moment they found him. But his family looked at that timeline, and then they looked at his body, and they simply couldn't accept it. Marks that don't match the paperwork. When Roy's body came home, his wife Judy opened the coffin, and the people standing nearby saw something that didn't line up with the story they'd been told. There were bruises. One former bandmate who was in the room described it bluntly. It looked to him like Roy's head had struck something, but there were marks on his head he could clearly see with his own eyes. A journalist who was close to Roy reported seeing that same bruising. To the people who loved him, those marks simply didn't fit the picture of a man who had quietly harmed himself alone in a cell. And here's the detail that has kept the questions alive for over 35 years. According to Roy's biographer, the county coroner's official report never mentioned any bruising on Buchanan's head at all. The marks the family swears they saw weren't anywhere in the official paperwork. There are other small inconsistencies too, ones that have never been fully resolved. Differences between the earliest police account and later retellings about exactly what he was found hanging from, and even what he was wearing at the time. None of this proves anything on its own. No evidence of foul play has ever been formally presented, and the official cause of death has never been officially changed. His biographer, after weighing everything available, landed on a careful, honest conclusion: that there were still missing pieces to this puzzle, and that being truthful about the evidence meant withholding final judgment rather than forcing a neat ending onto a messy story. So that's where it still sits, more than 3.5 decades later. An official ruling sitting on one side of the scale, a family that never believed it sitting on the other, and a set of bruises that one document recorded and another one somehow left out entirely. Roy Buchanan was buried 3 days after he died, in a cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, not far from the very home where he'd raised his 7 kids. He was 48 years old. Roy Buchanan. Roy Buchanan played on hit records and watched other men take all the credit. He mentored the guitarist who'd go on to help define the band, and somehow turned a werewolf joke into rock history. He may or may not have turned down the biggest band on the planet. National television crowned him the world's greatest unknown guitarist. He sold 500,000 records, played Carnegie Hall, and still went home most nights feeling like a fraud who'd never actually made it. Jeff Beck dedicated songs to him. Eric Clapton called him the best there was. Les Paul once said, "The strangest, most beautiful sounds coming out of modern guitar seem to trace right back to Roy first." Musicians who went on to become legends themselves studied a man who never quite became one. And here's the part that sticks with you the longest. Remember that line he said, standing in a cotton field for the cameras, about how he never made it big because he never really cared about making it big. For years, people took that as humility, maybe even wisdom. But go back and listen to it again, knowing how his story ends, and it starts to sound like something else entirely. It sounds like a man who decided early on that he simply didn't deserve the one thing he was better at than almost anyone alive. He spent his whole life screaming on the inside, while his face stayed perfectly calm. He built little myths just to make his own story feel big enough to carry. And he died in a room where the clock only ran for about 21 minutes, leaving behind marks on his body that still don't quite match the official paperwork. The records are still out there. That old television film still exists if you go looking. Somewhere, his 1953 Telecaster, the one he nicknamed Nancy, still sits. The instrument he somehow taught to talk, and weep, and scream. And the question is still out there too, the one his family has carried for over 35 years now. Not just how the world's greatest unknown guitarist ended up forgotten by so many, but what actually happened in that jail cell on the last night of his life. So tell me, which part of this got you the most? The hit records he never got credit for? That Rolling Stones offer that might not have even been real? Or those 21 minutes nobody's ever been able to fully explain? Drop it in the comments. And if you're into these stories about the geniuses history somehow walked right past, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there are plenty more where this one came from.